Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to focus on implementing Industry 4.0 for the food and beverage industry. My name is Jason Dietrich. I lead our commercial operations at Tulip, and I'm the head of revenue in terms of my title. Before we get started with the webinar, I do want to spend a few minutes on Tulip. Tulip is a frontline operations platform that empowers the world's frontline workforce to improve productivity, to ensure high quality, and to maximize efficiency in your operations. We have a no-code platform that helps companies to digitally transform their processes, guide the frontline worker, and gain real-time visibility into their people, machines, and processes that are involved in those manufacturing and operational settings. Our goal is to do that all in a matter of days. Today, we'll be talking about why the food and beverage leaders around the globe are taking this journey down a path to Industry 4.0 implementations. Today, we're going to focus on scaling and innovating with the goal of helping our customers with flawless execution. Before we get started, I do have a couple housekeeping items. Please feel free to ask questions during the webinar. We will answer those live during the webinar through the questions tab. For those questions that we don't answer live, we will answer those directly via email after the webinar. We're also recording this, so you'll get a link to the recording after the webinar. You can use that for your own reference or to share with your colleagues. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague on this call. Sanjay, can you please introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jason. Hi, folks. I'm Sanjay Rajan, and I'm responsible for our industry solutions here at Tulip, and excited to be part of this webinar and have a chat with everybody, and hope we have a good Q&A sessions too.
Great. Thanks, Sanjay. As we go through this, our goal will be to cover really three topics throughout this webinar. The first is a little bit about the state of the industry. What's happening in food and beverage? What are some of the challenges that we see? We'll then move into how do you apply Industry 4.0 to the food and beverage vertical? What changes are happening and how can you utilize the latest technology platforms and applications that are available to help you in this journey? And then part three will be focused on truly implementing Industry 4.0 best practices. So to start, I'm going to begin with a little bit on the state of the industry. When we think about the food and beverage industry, we think about the fact that this is an industry that's been around for a very long time. But even knowing that, the industry continues to innovate. And what we wanted to highlight here were kind of four areas that we're seeing from our own customers, our own prospects, and discussions with industry analysts. The first is this idea of innovating, that companies and manufacturers are bringing in new equipment while having to leverage their existing equipment. Essentially, as product lines evolve, as they're looking at ways of being more productive and more efficient, they have to deal with this mix of both old and new machines. And that means connectivity challenges, production changes, the ability to leverage both of those sets of assets to make the new product lines and the existing products that they have in a given manufacturing facility. In addition, innovation is constantly happening on the categories that are happening in the food and beverage market. New categories around gluten-free or plant-based manufacturing, or new ways to manufacture things they've done for a very long time. It's causing those companies to have to figure out how to maximize their current assets and current equipment and manufacture new goods and services while still manufacturing things that they've been serving to their markets for a very long time. Of course, in the food and beverage market, it's very regulated, similar to the FDA. So the innovation that's occurring around making sure critical process parameters are tracked, regulatory compliance is always a key, and ultimately quality and safety being of the utmost importance. And consumers are also changing, and that's requiring innovation in the food and beverage industry. Consumers are demanding more about understanding how things are manufactured, what ingredients are going into those products, and they're doing more inspection on the products that they choose based on that learning and knowing more about all the facets of how those products and services are manufactured. In talking with many companies, whether they're our customer, our prospect, or through the industry analysts that we work with, we try to summarize some goals that we see for food and beverage leaders from around the globe. As I mentioned earlier, first and foremost, achieving the highest quality product, making sure we're making it safely and at an affordable market price. The demand that's out there in the market now, due to COVID, due to these changing conditions, is driving more products in the market and making it hard for those companies that aren't competitive from a pricing standpoint. So not only do we want to make sure it's safely made, high quality, but it has to be affordable. That innovation around new products, and like I mentioned earlier, being able to innovate, but while using your same assets, your same equipment, the same production processes, being able to adapt to making those new products with that same infrastructure. The need to align R&D seamlessly to the production line because of the speed of innovation, the number of new offerings and products that are being manufactured, there has to be tight alignment from the engineering side of the business to the manufacturing side. Again, listening to consumer feedback and being able to adapt quickly, making sure we can scale production to meet that demand. Demands for these new products, demands for products that at one point kind of had very steady demand, with that increasing with more need for, prepared foods in the marketplace. We have to be able to scale production while meeting high safety and quality standards. And ultimately, all of our businesses in the food and beverage market certainly care about maintaining the appropriate profit margins, ensuring that across our brands, we're meeting our manufacturing standards that drive the profits we expect for the business. So kind of what are we hearing as the challenges that are facing the leaders in the food and beverage industry that is maybe preventing them from that flawless execution that we all desire? I won't go through all of these in detail. You can read those on your own and listen to the webinar after the fact, but I would say a couple key ones. Certainly real-time visibility, the idea of seeing our progress towards meeting our targets. How do we become more proactive? Right now, most environments are getting the data delayed. They're being reactive. By that point, you might have a miss in quality, a miss in safety, or you've missed your performance metrics. Certainly batch traceability, the idea of genealogy and traceability is critical in food and beverage. And right now, companies are drowning in paper to track that and be compliant. How can we help with electronic batch records, making sure we have full genealogy and traceability of the who, what, and when of our manufacturing? Worker errors. The whole goal of Industry 4.0 and certainly the Tulip platform is this idea of error-proofing our processes, trying to make it as easy as we can for an operator to follow their instructions, execute their production, and ultimately make that product the way we anticipate. And one more that I'll pick is just siloed data. Many companies have gone down a path where you've been collecting a lot of data. You might have a historian, you might have a data lake, you might have pockets of information, but right now that data is not in one common location or is not easily accessible so that data can be used to make decisions. And I think a goal of any food and beverage manufacturer going down this path of trying to execute more efficiently, having access to that data and turning into information is very important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sanjay and allow Sanjay to kind of talk through some of these challenges in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Jason. You spoke about some of the drivers for the industry, especially on guiding manufacturers how to stay ahead of the competition in a very rapidly changing market. There is a very generational shift on how food is viewed, right? The time is really ripe for addressing some of the systemic challenges that have hung around with manufacturers in their factories for a while now, right? So looking at the right side of the slide, really on the challenges going bottom up, with the recipes changing, with plant-based ingredients, for example, recipes are changing and traceability becomes a real issue. If you're making the same recipe over and over again, you build a lot of muscle memory in your manufacturing, right? But you can't rely just on that these days. You definitely can't rely on paper or on siloed data. And what you really want is to be able to cast a tight net over your batch traceability and have a real handle on it, right? The other thing right above that is you need operational data to become visible so that you can plan and better execute, especially when your demand patterns and recipes and consumer needs are changing, right? Again, having the muscle memory and built into the tribal knowledge of people's heads is okay, but not anymore, right? Food safety and quality is critical, but manually inspecting in that quality and relying again on people is just not scalable. You can't meet your demand without adding much more manual labor, and your compliance activities then just become more and more, especially with the FDA standards tightening as we go forward, right? And finally, scaling to meet that demand is only possible with automation, But time and again, manufacturers don't get all of the ROI that they expect when they make these investments. Line stoppages are not an issue when you have like a dedicated line making one product because you kind of work that out of the system. But when you need flexibility within a plant and be able to do changeovers and do multiple recipes and have a lot of batch runs, then you need to know what causes that stoppage. So in a sense, these things kind of systematically impinge on productivity, and the effects of these operational changes are clear. And this is something everybody can identify with, right? Manual data that goes into a graveyard of paper or a digital silo. You have a new workforce that needs to be trained quickly on especially changing recipes and changing processes, right? Which, while they get up to speed, it invariably leads to a spike in waste. Whether they're a new person or if it's a new machine, there is always that perturbation that it causes in the process. So how do you avoid that? Which then during those times leads to unplanned expenses and headaches, especially to try to get product out on time, right? It's a very unforgiving consumer market where we demand food, and we especially processed food, we expect it to be there and be on the shelf, right? And so any delay or inefficiency means that your competition is catching up on you, right? And your inability to differentiate from your competitors will affect your bottom line, right? So the worst case scenario in this are the last couple of bullets, where really any mistake that you make, you not only fail your own standards, but what happens is that you have this increased potential to have some kind of a recall, right? And that's your worst case scenario. And obviously everybody is working hard to try and avoid that. But the reality is that they happen, and they happen almost one a day, which is, as a percentage of what is produced, that's impressively low because we produce a lot of food. But it is what every manufacturer has to go through on a daily basis to not be one of them who has a recall that day is what we are trying to avoid, right? And that's exactly what I want to talk to you about. So if you just pick on that thread of recalls, which is either, you end up in that worst scenario where you have to do a recall, or you're pedaling really fast on a daily basis to ever avoid that, either case, there are some common reasons why these cause kind of stoppages in your production, right? And let's pick on two of them for the sake of this webinar. Let's talk about kind of undeclared ingredients. And this is like literally if I go to a FDA site and look up kind of root cause of what that recall was, it'll either group it as undeclared ingredients or compromised product, right? Undeclared ingredients is when there is a discrepancy between kind of your master data, whether it's in your ERP system or your recipe management system, and what was actually produced or marked and shipped, right? And that discrepancy is kind of painful, but that's what you want to try and avoid, right? The other side of it is compromised product, where even a small variation in your process can cause a problem, right? Especially when your recipes have changed, or you're moving one recipe to another line, or there is a variation between shifts in the same factory. Whatever the reasons are, if you're not monitoring that process tightly, then that can cause a problem, right? So let's go pick at these things a little bit more, just in the context of what really happens in operations. And let's take a look at like a generic food production line. And it's a very simplistic one, which goes from basically a few batch operations to a hybrid operation to a conveyor lines. Your production lines may definitely be more complex and expected to be complex. But the idea here is really just to kind of illustrate activities and operations that are in place today to keep your line running, right? How do you get that master recipe that you have, which is digital to begin with, but ends up being on paper as you go through your operations? So you see a couple of those blocks that are highlighted in a different color. And really the illustration here is to show that ideally your master recipe is exactly what you want to produce. And you want to start at like a weigh and dispense step, which usually is manual and is error prone, especially when you have changing recipes. But your need is that how do you track that kind of in an electronic batch record, right? So if you look at kind of your error source in this, instead of having a digital system or an electronic batch record that you can absolutely automatically generate, what a lot of people have is paper-based travelers. And these paper-based travelers turn out to be your song sheet, right? Which is what you have to follow. But when you convert that to a paper-based record, you open yourself to a lot of issues, right? With recipe changing and less experienced workforce and a greater demand just fuels this problem, right? Especially writing down supplier lot numbers or manually signing off operations after the fact, especially, or recording some key process data onto paper, or maybe even keep punching it into a digital silo is not a recipe for that flawless execution that Jason talked about, right? So how do you fix some of these things is something that we will talk about when we start talking about kind of digital transformation or the proverbial kind of industry 4.0, right? The other one that we can talk about, which is very common as a root cause, is like mislabeling and mispackaging, right? What happened in the production line, again, highlighting some of the key activities that ought to be connected through a central nervous system, but is not, right? Which is really mismanaging kind of your label management, right? Getting labels all the time is completely non-trivial, given all the requirements that are imposed on manufacturers, again, with end customers being different, state level, country level regulations, all of these impact what gets printed on a label. But to start your process, a manufacturer knows exactly what that needs to be. They know what that end state needs to be. But what gets trickier is when you have single sources of failure or unreliable single sources of failure, which is I've walked into some really well-run, highly automated manufacturing facilities where right when it comes to programming or punching in at the label printer console what the label change needs to be, that's done with the source material as a paper or a post-it note or a handwritten board that is stuck on top of that label printer console with a code and an expiry date. And it really just is something that operations managers have pointed out to me to say, look, after all this investment, it comes down to punching this correct in, right? And otherwise it's entirely, God forbid, it ships out with bad labels, right? So pulling that right label up and syncing it exactly with the recipe that's running on the line, which then again syncs to your master data, is really what you need and to completely avoid this single point of failure, right? And the last example that we'll look here is around compromised product, right? Again, back on that same theme of you're doing all of this right, but how do you avoid that one time when you end up contaminating a product and, hopefully you catch it before it gets out of the door. Worst case is it gets out, but you're able to limit the damage, right? And this is the one scenario that every manufacturer wants to avoid, right? It could be something as straightforward as dispensing incorrect ingredients at that weigh and dispense step, right? Which potentially then hopefully you gets identified in an offline sampling quality station, right? Where you're either pulling samples off the line or you're doing it in process. But what you hope is that any mistake you make, for example, at a weigh and dispense gets caught immediately at a sampling step. Or your contamination could not be because of that, but it could be through process variable changes, right? Which means temperature changed, or you had an unusually hot and humid day, or on that one particular day, the power draw, the current draw at your mixer was a little low for whatever it is, or voltage was not maintained. So whatever that process variable is, if you're not monitoring that, you definitely are relying again on manual quality checks and inspection points to catch your problem, right? The last point I'll make on that is that even if you're recording all this data, let's say you do your quality inspection checks and you write everything down, you're monitoring your process, you put it into a historian silo, right? Which is a box that's sitting on the floor that's just collecting all of this data. It's very painful for you to recover because you'll have to sync up all that information with what exact run, right? What batch and what runs did you do on that particular time period and what was affected, right? So minimizing your potential for recall or minimizing the amount of wastage that you've created without compromising safety is the pain that you're trying to avoid, right? With that, let's talk about kind of what process data collection must really be. Now, it needs to be precise and it needs to help you stop the issue before you ship product out of the door, right? And operations like weigh and dispense or your quality checks, these need to be absolutely connected with each other if you really want to kind of get ahead of the game, right? In each of the examples above, from a Tulip standpoint, and Jason and I have been through this journey through at least over a decade, is really this notion of digital transformation, right? In each of these examples, the answer is if we digitally transform our shop floor, we can get a better handle on it. Well, how do you do that, right? And really the phrase that I want to kind of pull up here is kind of digital augmentation, right? That is, take each of your operational process and augment it with the digital connection. It's either a connection to a machine or it's connection to ERP and or it's connected to simple user interfaces that validate that process before things get worse, right? And again, this is less reliance on muscle memory and tribal knowledge and more reliance on a connected, digitized system that works for you, right? And you can look at the bullet points here on the slide, right? Whether it is pulling master data from ERP and connecting it to your operations, validating your labels digitally, building electronic batch records automatically as you connect one process to another, right? And finally, avoiding paper-based data logging, especially around quality, compliance activities, and process monitoring, right? These things absolutely will automatically error-proof things, increase your speed to how you react to any issue. And as you do more of this, you get into the prevention mode, prevent the issue rather than reacting to it. Compliance and safety is critical for you folks, but how much manual effort are you going to go put into it, right? And it just compromises completely all this ROI that you want from your automation, right? And finally, give your employees, give the supervisors, the production managers, and the workers there satisfaction on a day's end that they have produced a product that is completely safe and compliant and they're confident of it, right? So with that, Jason, if you could kind of give us a perspective on applying this Industry 4.0, we talk about digital transformation, but we talk about it in the terms of digital augmentation. How do you apply this in the food industry? Right?
Okay, thank you, Sanjay. I appreciate it. What I'm going to spend a little bit of time on is a refresher on Industry 4.0 and kind of set us up for how do we apply it, and then ultimately, how do we help implement best practices. So a quick refresher on Industry 4.0. This is a term that has been in the market for about a decade. It started in the 2011 timeframe and really started to gain traction in the mid kind of 2015, 2016. But really, truly, we're seeing the adoption of Industry 4.0 happening every day as companies look to digitally transform. Think of this as the fusion of manufacturing technologies, things like machine learning and AI and big data and IoT. And it's this idea of the interaction of physical and digital to ultimately drive fundamental change in the way we produce, again, focused on productivity and efficiency. I like to think about Industry 4.0 as focusing on the interconnection of people, systems, and machines to make yourself more operationally efficient. So what is Industry 4.0 characterized by? And we put a few bullets on each of these. First of all, a suite of digital technologies focused on achieving scalability and ROI in an industrial context. The changing relationship, again, between people, systems, and things. A dispersion in a pace sufficient to earn the title revolution. Think of this as going faster than previous industrial revolutions, faster adoption, faster ROI, faster deployments. There are three main drivers in Industry 4.0 that are focused on manufacturing. The first is the same thing we talked about in the food and beverage industry, this idea of how do I merge old and new technologies simultaneously? How do I work with old and new equipment to produce in new ways? The convergence of use cases in manufacturing. It's no longer focused only on yield or productivity or machine downtime. Now it's the idea of creating that batch record, understanding full traceability and genealogy, thinking about things like safety, quality, and environmental data collection. So the use cases have become a lot broader when you think about Industry 4.0 initiatives within inside an organization. And ultimately, the idea here is adoption at scale. How do we make sure that every facility we have has the ability to adopt a new technology and get the benefits from that new technology? Historically, what I found is large monolithic systems get deployed to the largest sites. They take a long time. They're very expensive, but you never get to sites 2, 3, 10, 20, or the sites that maybe don't have the IT infrastructure or the personnel to drive a deployment. With today's technologies, you can certainly achieve this adoption at scale. So what could the end result be after you implement an Industry 4.0 type technology platform or set of applications? First is becoming digitized. We've talked about batch records, we've talked about other data, making those fully digital, no paper, fully accessible. We like to think about the augmented worker. Again, thinking about that frontline worker and how can we error-proof their production? How can we empower them to work more effectively, in a more productive fashion? And how do we make sure that they fully follow all the compliance requirements that we have? Connected. All of our assets are connected. Our systems are connected. And we have this integrated view of our overall operations from our ERP, our LIMS, our warehouse management system, and then this Industry 4.0 type platform pulls it all together into an integrated, very usable system to drive operations. Leaders in food and beverage, we believe, are now empowered to do this. We're seeing it every day with our customers. Again, talking to the analysts, we're seeing that new global providers of technology have helped food and beverage companies start to monitor their equipment and their production in real time. They now have visibility to plant metrics, machine level data, the ability to compare one facility versus another and make sure that performance is being led equally across the enterprise. We certainly see food and beverage leaders improving their performance. Changes are being made based on machine and worker data that's available in real time and helping to improve the way we produce. Because safety, compliance, and quality are held in such high regard inside of food and beverage, we certainly want to make sure we're driving those, building standardized procedures for audits, safety walks, making sure that there are apps that are configurable to do these things and empower that frontline worker to achieve these goals. And ultimately, I've said this a few times, the idea is scale. You can grow, you can test new products, you can meet new demands, you can release new offerings. You can do that all in the confines of your existing assets and equipment, but do it in a more efficient way. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sanjay to take us home and talk a little bit about an augmented production line and how we're going to implement best practices using Industry 4.0.
Thanks, Jason. Again, I throw back the one diagram of a representative line only to make this point that says even a single line has a whole bunch of complex things that you need to get product out of the door. What you want is all of these processes and activities to be connected, again, like I said, by one digital nervous system, right? And today, the technology and the methods to do it are just getting better and better. I personally have been in the MES, IoT, ERP solution space for over 10 to 12 years now. And I think this is a great time for those kind of ideas and concepts to not exist in like separate platforms, but come together and deliver the promise to manufacturers, right? So I want to make like three things that should be in your mind as you think of how do you do your digital transformation journey is. One is cloud-based solutions are here. They are easy to adopt, and not just software alone, but there are edge devices that are available that connect your machines and your people back to the cloud. What this allows is for really ease of use of deployment and adoption, but also offers tremendously easy scalability, which has just not existed in manufacturing factory solutions, right? The second thing is user interfaces are just getting better and better. I mean, people are today used to shopping on Amazon or using their smartphone, Android or iPhone, and everybody has this notion of interfaces need to be simple and you pick something up and you just use it. You don't need a manual for it, right? So especially when you have this workforce shift into a younger generation of workforce, this is not a nice to have, but it's something that the workforce demands, right? And the last part I would say is what's kind of plagued this a little bit is that any solution that's deployed has been very IT dependent, right? So unless you get into the IT queue to get a solution deployed, you just have to wait. But solutions that are cloud-based with simpler user interfaces, with edge devices, and more so recently, no code being a very big game changer, it really puts the power in the hands of manufacturing engineers, process engineers, the folks who know the process, who are in daily contact with your workers. These are the folks to whom the power needs to be given to for them to deploy, right? So let's just briefly talk about successful implementation of an Industry 4.0 practice, right? To keep this simple, I think really the notion here is and we've mentioned this a couple of times now, is really looking at your journey from a digital augmentation perspective, which means put your frontline workers at the center of this digital transformation and attack it one issue at a time. And that can be done in the form of a pilot or looking at a smaller footprint of what you want to solve for, getting that solved, and then scaling and growing organically around that solution, right? The big question here is really around how much of a cut do you want to take out of an implementation, right? Which means how much inflexibility and risk are you taking versus how much value do you want to see early on? There's no perfect answer to this, but clearly in all the years that I've been doing it, I definitely have developed a bias for a particular way of doing it. And really that way is really trying to not take the all or nothing high risk solution, but to really take this and break it down in the form of low risk pilots. So just to talk about that for a couple of minutes, if you look at the top of this, these may be extremes here represented, but it's really to represent a point of where should that bias be. The current digital transformation approach that I've been a part of, going back a few years, is very much a big bang, high wire act, right? It starts off with like a spreadsheet of like potentially 300 line items and an analysis of every process in your factory, and then mapping that to be digitally transformed state, right? Which itself is a big activity. And even the very few who have the stamina to engage with vendors and get to the point of execution or implementation, they find out that, a year and a half has passed or 2 years have passed, and the original simple goals of why we wanted to transform our business is completely lost in the shuffle, right? And unfortunately, I've been front and center of some of these, and that doesn't happen because people intend for this to happen. It's just that it's built to kind of fail in majority of the cases, unfortunately, even though the technology is right there, right? So the way we recommend you really embark on this journey is to be laser focused on what that first issue needs to be solved. So instead of pushing all your value to the time when you start to implement that big bang, start getting value quickly. And just like I mentioned a few minutes ago, and Jason mentioned this too, today the technology exists to deliver solutions almost like in the form of apps, right? So when you get laser focused on the first issue, solve it and get value out of that solution before you start the next one, right? And there's no prescription on where you want to start. It could be initially improving utilization. Just focus on that. Or it could be, let's start to focus on traceability, right? Or it may be, let's get all our compliance GXP activities, whether they be audits or line checks or quality checks, let's get all of that digitized first so that we find out where our Achilles heel is, right? So what is more important is step by step, you first implement something, see the value, and that naturally that value will fund the next augmentation, right? And I keep harping on this augmentation because you're doing a lot of things that are already correct. What you really need this entire process to feel like, it should more feel like downloading the next app from an app store, right? Which is exactly the way we use our smartphones and our tablets today is we don't download a million apps on day one and try to figure everything out. As the need arises, we go grab the next one. And in many cases, these apps are interconnected, right? Today, when we go download an app, to improve our lifestyle, you see that it's automatically connected to the health bar on your iPhone, right? So really, this is not just a pipe dream. This kind of platform stack with services, with apps is available. And it's just a question of vendors as well as manufacturers getting together and proving this out, that this is indeed possible. And if you look at that value at the bottom, it's really just a continuous value chain, right, that you're going on. Right? So to finish off here on the critical themes today, we've kind of hit between Jason and me, hopefully 3 critical themes, right? One is workforce transformation cannot be entirely automated away. And what we mean by that is, getting more machines and automating is the way to scale. But that, in a sense, does not mean that a skilled labor force that is required to run those machines and innovate your processes is automated away. And so empowering your frontline workers and the next generation of employees that you have, giving them the right tools so that they continuously focus on innovating that process and innovating around your automation is going to be critical for your success, right? And focus and invest on what you can control, right? I mean, especially for the next year and a half, I've read enough predictions that there are going to be supply chain issues that are going to increase, right? There are going to be certain factors here that none of us control, but the ones that you control are what happens within the four walls of your factory. And so flawless execution is something that you should invest in, right? And the last part is really just what we just touched on, right? How do I do that flawless execution? It's a journey, but that journey needs to be one step at a time, one use case at a time. Use the technology, use where we are today with platforms and with applications and with edge devices, invest in them so that you can start grabbing these problems one at a time. And eventually in a year and a half, you have digitally transformed. You didn't set out to do that in a big bang, but you got there, right? So with that, I'll have Jason kind of round us off here and tell us what else is in store for you folks from a Tulip standpoint. Right?
Thanks, Sanjay. Hopefully everyone gained some valuable insights from this. We certainly believe in the food and beverage industry in terms of Industry 4.0 initiatives, the ability to transform, and certainly with that focus on operational efficiency and productivity. Hopefully, again, you gain some insights that can help you in your own business. We certainly want to thank you for attending and participating in this. Be on the lookout for the recording, and hopefully you have a chance to kind of revisit the recording as well as share it with some of your colleagues. As one plug for a future upcoming virtual event that we have, October 14th, we will be hosting an event called Democratizing the Edge, Next Gen Operations. Our goal is to help you learn how leading companies are leveraging powerful next gen edge technology to improve their operations. That'll be Thursday, October 14th at 10 a.m. Eastern. And again, I want to thank you for your participation and take care.